We now move on to our second session of day 2, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Derek Wilding, Co-Director, Centre for Media Transition at the University of Technology, Sydney, and also President of the IIC Australia chapter, and also Director of the Board of the IIC. He's also our moderator for your second panel of the day on online content regulation. So welcome, Derek, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and welcome everyone to this session on online content. It's another rapidly evolving area, and disentangling the threads of this topic is difficult enough on a national level, I guess. So today we'll be exploring some ways of approaching this question, and also some of the specifics around some aspects of online content regulation and how they play out across different jurisdictions. So a little bit like we've had in the fascinating session that we've just listened to on the metaverse. This session we've arranged so that we'll start with a couple of our speakers from civil society and academia, and then we'll move on to our representatives from industry and regulators. So we'll pause after those first two speakers before we move on. So what I might do now is just introduce our speakers briefly to you, and then we'll launch into it. So first of all, Tursha Sarkar is a policy officer with the Centre for Internet and Society in India. She's a lawyer by training and a researcher of internet regulation and law. At the Centre for Internet and Society, she specialises in intermediary liability, free speech, algorithmic content moderation, and platform transparency. Our second speaker will be Dr. Chen-Ling Hung. Chen-Ling is Professor and Director of the Graduate Institute of Journalism at the National Taiwan University, and is on the board of Taiwan Media Watch Foundation and the Council of the Campaign for Media Reform. Until 2020, she was a commissioner with the National Communications Commission of Taiwan. Liz Thomas is Director of Public Policy, Digital Safety with Microsoft based in New Zealand, where she coordinates global engagement on digital safety issues and supports work to address illegal and harmful content online, including child sexual exploitation and abusive imagery, as well as terrorist and violent extremist content. She previously worked with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Dr. Jean-Pierre Skerry is Acting Director of Legal Affairs with the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority in Bahrain. He has worked in private practice and in-house in cable, PSTN and mobile across a number of jurisdictions, including the UK, Central Europe and the Middle East. At TRA, his work has included the legal separation of the incumbent, the National Broadband Network Project, review of the licensing regime and a rewrite of telecommunications law. And Kathy Rainsford is General Manager of the Content and Consumer Division of the Australian Communications and Media Authority, responsible for areas such as broadcasting, news and media, disinformation, interactive gambling, unsolicited communications and telecommunications consumer protections. She previously held senior leadership positions with the Attorney General's Department in Australia and with the Department of Communications and the Arts, where she led the Spectrum and Security branch. So we've got a great lineup with diverse backgrounds and experience. Like I say, we're going to kick off with our two contributors from civil society and academia, then ask a couple of questions, and we'll pause for a moment to see if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. I believe you've got your question button ready to go. Then we'll move on to our industry and regulator representatives. So Tursha, perhaps you'd like to lead us off.
Sure, thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who is here. Really excited to hear from my co-panelists as well. So what I'll spend the next 5 to 7 minutes is just talking a little bit about the region where I'm from, setting the context for the problems that I have observed in this last couple of years and why it's important to think about these problems in this particular way. So I come from India, which has had a very interesting decade, 2 decades of history with online content regulation. We started out following global examples across the European Union or the United States, treating online platforms as mere conduits, as passive carriers. And as the global outlook towards intermediaries has changed, and as political ideologies have seen a transformation, the approach towards online content and to a larger extent online platforms has also really changed. So if some of you have been following the news, you might have noticed that last year in 2021, the Indian government passed the information technology rules, which significantly sought to alter the status quo of how online content regulation will look like. And it was not a good amendment that the government had brought forward. There was lot of the obligations under that rule leveraged a much stricter liability framework on online content platforms. And in turn, that really impacted how user freedom and online freedom of expression even was gonna turn out in the coming days. There was also a lot of controversy about the way the regulations sort of overreach their scope to digital news platforms and OTT platforms. And there is a lot of constitutional challenges that are pending in domestic courts across India. And a lot of these, the contentions raised by the petitioners in these cases have been very legit. So I think it's an interesting perspective to see where this regulation even pans out and how it looks in a couple of years down the road. But when I also started thinking about these regulations and trying to understand what it means for India, what really stood out to me was that how similar India's problems were to its neighbors. So that's to its South Asian neighbors at large. So you take Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Each of these countries in the last 5 years have either enacted similar sort of controversial online content regulation or are in the process of putting together almost a copycat legislation and obligating intermediaries in similar ways. So if you look at all these regulations pending, enacted, whatever together, there are a couple of trends that emerges that I thought would be very interesting for everyone to even think about. One is that there exists in the pipes a regulation like this. Second, that each of these regulations have been rationalized by the respective domestic governments on national security, public order, communal harmony, and so on, and similar sort of rationalization, very strikingly similar sort of rationalizations, in fact. And then from there, if you look at where these rationalizations are coming from, you see that they are rooted in largely a bunch of disinformation mediated, hate speech mediated humanitarian harms. And that's not a surprise to anyone. I think there has been repeated instances across this region of basically online hate speech, online disinformation leading to real harms received by minority communities, by women, by sexual minorities, and so on. So that's where the government rationalization of national security are rooted in legitimate aims. But when you look at disinformation and hate speech on this online content, and you take that train of thought a little further, you get to see that these online platforms, the large ones, Facebook, Twitter, Google, they may or may not have something to do with how the problem got here in the first place. This can either be by a direct, either be by chronic underinvestment in the capacities and resources they have put in this region, or it can just be by simple negligence or simple omission of any meaningful action. So it's a strange cycle that forms in my head, where you have the government passing laws that lead to democratic backsliding, which leads to platforms having a much stricter liability, which leads to user rights being put on the backslide, and it goes on and on. And there really doesn't seem to be a very clear way out of this. And so where do you go from here? How do you even begin to grapple with this question? How do you begin to think about how to even introduce changes? So one thing that I thought is a problem that kind of ties all of these issues together is the absence of information. If you compare the kind of information, the kind of initiatives that exist in Western markets and the kind of initiatives that bigger social media platforms have voluntarily taken part in Western markets, and you compare that to their approaches to non-Western markets, smaller countries, you see there's a very clear gulf of information that users in the United States are entitled to versus the kind of information that users in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are entitled to. So one way of addressing this is to start identifying the gaps in these kind of information that exist and building advocacy and awareness campaigns that seeks to ask these difficult questions in the first place. I'll give you a small example here. So last year, my colleagues and I, we started trying to understand what the approach of major online platforms have been towards caste. Caste is it's a typical issue of the South Asian diaspora, and it's basically a sort of socio-political hierarchy that's assigned to you in birth, and you are unequal from birth on. And it's a big problem in terms of how majority identities and minority identities are constructed here. And once we started asking these questions, it made us realize that these platforms have been in India at least for anywhere between 10 to 12 years. And despite this, it took them anywhere between 5 to 10 years to even start acknowledging that caste, that abuses and hate speech based on caste is hate speech in the first place, because these platforms came to our country equipped with hate speech that is based on race, hate speech that's based on gender, but not caste. So once you identify that, okay, this is a problem that they are not addressing, then you can start thinking about how to ask more pointed questions, how you can ask them, what are you doing right now to help, what are you doing to make sure that the efforts by anti-caste activists offline are not being curtailed online? And similar kind of mounting questions and asking these difficult questions is, I think, the key to go forward. I'm going to stop here for now. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but very happy to field more questions as we go forward.
Thanks very much, Tosha. So yes, I'll come back to you in a moment. Maybe Chenling, would you like to give us your opening comments, and then we'll take those two together.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering if I can show my slides to the audience. Let me try. Okay, thank you. Yeah, here I just want to briefly introduce about the initiative of content regulation in Taiwan, putting it in the context of transitional democracy of Taiwan's short history. So you can see that Taiwan is under the Japanese colonialism and also the long ruling of the KMT from mainland China. But in the past 30 years, Taiwan is kind of, making it's on its path of the regular democracy. But in recent years, we think that democracy is under attack. There's some evidence, according to the international research released in 2019 by the University of Gothenburg. Yeah, they show that Taiwan is the most targeted country in the world regarding foreign misinformation. And also local media also reveal that, especially in year 2020, because it's the presidential election year of Taiwan. And the evidence show that there were indeed those who served the Chinese Communist Party's side, who tried to intervene into Taiwan's election by spread disinformation. Here's very interesting case and evidence. On the right-hand side, you can see, because there are two presidential candidates from the KMT and the DPP. And the right-hand side is the the survey results from the Apple Daily's newspaper in Taiwan. But on the left-hand side, you can see, there's a lot of rumors in the social media and the digital platforms. They provide different stories of the survey results. So the government and the civil society started working together to try to combat disinformation, and which we saw a very severe problems in Taiwan. And this model is, I try to put it from our research, which was published last year. We call it a cross-sector collaboration approach. In this approach, we can see the major stakeholders, which include the civil societies, a lot of citizen organizations, and also the government. And another major parts, including the online platform business and also traditional media. And here I will show you some cases and the practice in Taiwan. The first chart shows that the government developed 4 strategies for the prevention and control of disinformation, which include identify, debug, and contain, and finally punish those sites who spread disinformation. And if you see from the second labeled, in which step they all require the collaboration between the government and the civil society. For example, in the second step, to debug disinformation, the government work with the third-party fact-checking organizations to help to spread the truthness to the public. And in the third step, to contain disinformation, it requires a lot of efforts from the media platforms to they have to verify misinformation and try to degrade the ranking of this kind of information. And during Taiwan's 2020 election, a lot of citizen organizations, they work together to provide real-time fact-checking during the president candidates debate. And it's quite creative in Taiwan. And we found it has very positive effect. And this slide tries to show how the government has to improve their efficiency to clarify information, especially this slide showed the information about the election, and some rumors show that the time and how to vote, this kind of thing, they provide wrong information to the public, which will influence the fairness of the election. And the following slide I want to show is that in Taiwan we have we use the international platforms such as Google, such as Facebook, and also like from Japan. And under graduate pressures, these platforms, they have some mechanism to help to maintain the fairness of Taiwan's election. For example, you can see Google suspended the election advertisement just 2 weeks before the election, and also provide fact-checking training with Taiwan's government officials. And this slide shows that Facebook cooperate with Taiwan's fact-check organizations. Whenever there are misinformation checked and identified by the third parties, Facebook will reduce the reach of this false information. And according to Facebook, they say that it helped to reduce about 80% of false information. And besides these, strategies, we believe that media literacy is more influential and more helpful, especially for the public, to help them to identify which is right and which is wrong, especially when they check the information online. And in addition to combat disinformation, especially in the past 3 months, there are some progress in Taiwan, especially dealing with online content. The NCC, that's the media regulator in Taiwan, just drafted the Digital Communication Act. It includes a notice and take-down approach and collective self-discipline from the platform industry. And also, Taiwan started to think about regulating OTT TV services. So there was a draft of the Act of Online Streaming Content Services. These are some highlights of this draft. First, it required transparency of operation and protection of consumers. And the second is requires self-regulation on content to protect children and minors. And the third, especially we try to learn it from EU's experiences to require the industry to make contributions and investment on Taiwanese local production. And finally, especially is the Taiwan spatial political situation and tension with mainland China. So it forbade investment from China. And my short conclusion here is that from the content of this draft initiatives, it seems that we need to move from regulation to governance, which requires the public and private partnership. And among the stakeholders, the most important, of course, is the civil society, which is the foundation of our democracy. And through media literacy to empower civil society, I believe is the major forces to combat disinformation or to enhance quality online information. And underneath, we need to think about to protect democracy from malicious information attack. But at the same time, we need to think more about how to balance between freedom of speech and the public interest, including national security. So here is my short presentation about the initiative in Taiwan. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chen-Ling. So far we've covered, we've mostly been speaking in terms of issues about disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech, I guess. But what's emerged from those two presentations from different jurisdictions is an interesting mix of approaches to regulation. So Chen-Ling, you were just talking about the movement from regulation to governance. And you mentioned self-regulation specifically in relation to minors. Torsha, you mentioned the absence of information, but in the context of a real crackdown by government and imposing a much stricter regime. So maybe if I start with you, keeping in mind this mix of approaches and your own emphasis upon the importance of information, do you think that in your region there's space for non-legislative approaches, industry-based or self-regulation to at least some aspects that perhaps might not bring with them the kinds of harms that you were talking about in relation to hate speech and comments about caste and so on. Do you think there's a role for that in relation to some aspects of this online content?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is probably yes. But I do think that it, like I am always an advocate for balance and like mixed methods. So I think it's not sufficient to put that onus of a correct regulation on one sector entirely and expect that sector to just run with it. So like just a like ham-fisted government regulation is not the answer. I also don't think that it's simply enough to just look to the industry to and ask the industry to issue self-regulatory code that is applicable to the entire citizenry. I think there is some room here for some sort of collaboration between governments, between industries, and between civil societies who are ostensibly representing user interests. And the sort of underscoring rationale for any regulatory approach that anybody with that power to do so comes up with has to keep the user as the priority, user rights as priority, and nothing else, because that's also has been part of the problem, is that not all of these regulatory approaches has been with the best interests of users and individuals in place. So I'll give you a short example of what I mean, what maybe a more user-centric regulation looks like. This is again like a bit of a plug back to the kind of work my colleagues have been doing, but I hope this the example sort of clears it up. So what my colleagues have been doing in collaboration with engineers, they have been trying to build a browser plugin that helps users to filter out gender-based hate speech from their news feeds, their Twitter feeds, their Facebook feeds, whatever this is. So the difference between this and an industry body or a specific online platform coming up with an algorithm for weeding out gender-based hate speech is in the latter approach, in the online content platforms approach. It's the platform calling the shots about what it understands to be sexist hate speech, right? And not only is it saying that I understand this, you're also saying that this understanding of mine is applicable across regions, across boundaries, across individual interests and individual characteristics. So, and that there are so many ways in which that can go wrong, and not just like we have seen it go wrong in previous instances, previous iterations of algorithms, previous iterations of regulation, where if it's one person sitting somewhere and saying that this is what I think should be followed by everyone and this is one size fits all, that obviously is not going to work. So if you're trying to find ways, if you're trying to think about that, okay, this is a problem and this obviously needs a solution, but how can we create a solution that puts the power in the hands of the user to sort of address the solution in their own terms? I think that's a great approach to go forward with. It's so in this project also, then it's the user, depending on what background they are from, what they consider even to be sexism, they have the power to sort of curate their online experiences on their own terms. So projects like this, initiatives like this are something that's worthwhile for governments, industries, everyone to think about, where you place the user at the forefront of your approaches.
Okay, thank you, Torsha. And so Chen-Ling, just following from Torsha's comments, do you think that you've certainly emphasised your collaborative approach that's been taken in Taiwan? Do you think that has helped to gain sufficient attention to that user experience, place the user in the picture? And following from that, I wonder, is that collaborative approach, is there ways of, I suppose, measuring the impact or the effects or the success of that approach that you've been working on in Taiwan?
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question, but very difficult to answer because it's always very, very hard to assess the influence of information or speech, right? We cannot get the scientific evidence of, which like a 10% or 20% of effectiveness. But it's very good question. Just from one of my slides show that, the information provided by Facebook, because it says that they help to reduce the prevalence of about 80% of false information information of their, on their platform. So maybe that's one evidence. If we trust their, the number they provide, at least, they help to, reduce the spread of this kind of information we think which is harmful for the society. And maybe there are some other index we can try to measure. For example, we just had a survey in Taiwan, to ask about the public. Do they aware of the existence of false information around, their livelihood? About 80% of Taiwanese people said that yes, they have got false information from the online platform, which was higher than before. The other surveyed in several years ago. So from this side, this part of awareness, I believe it also works, to help people to know that there are a lot of rumor online, and also, not any information from your friends, they are, they are true. That's not right. And I also want, I think we need to develop more index, to help us to assess the, the sense of the impact of the strategies and the initiative we are trying to, because it's very new phenomena. And I also want to add another point about the government regulation. I think government regulation is not the best or the only, way for us to, deal with, harmful online information. But currently, I think it's kind of necessary. In Taiwan, we try to, develop this approach of co-regulation, and we think it's a kind of self-regulation, regulated self-regulation from the private sector. I hope it works, because it requires a lot of, I think it's communication and, communication and the negotiation among different parts. And I think it's the true meaning of democracy, isn't it? Okay, that's my answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I think that discussion perhaps provides a good backdrop for what we'll hear from Liz in terms of collaboration between different sectors. So Liz, could I ask, we'll move on now to our industry and regulator participants. So Liz, could I ask you to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek. And as you say, I think it's a really great segue into the conversation, which is comprised of industry and regulators, but we'll touch on some of these points, I think, as we move through. But I'd just like to start by saying, thank you so much for bringing us together today. It's really great to have the opportunity to share our perspective, and I think to collectively acknowledge the complexity of the wide range of online content issues. And I know across this panel, we're going to touch on a range of different content issues. But at a personal level, I've recently moved to a role in Microsoft's corporate digital safety team, but I was previously working on digital safety issues across the Asia Pacific region. So I've had a close focus on these topics and some of the major developments across the region. And in the Asia Pacific region, it is really important to acknowledge and understand trends here. As the Asia becomes the engine room of the world economy, it's a significant region. We'll obviously continue to look at Washington, DC and Brussels, but it's a diverse region. It's got a huge range of cultural and social and other differences to note, but we are all looking for ways to grapple with shared challenges, such as online harms. And online content regulation is one element of how we address these online harms and digital safety challenges is still an emerging area. And there's been a huge amount of change even in the last couple of years. and even more on the horizon. And, you know, Torsha mentioned the new Indian laws. It's one of many that have appeared across the region in the last wee while. And it means that all of our stakeholders, so government, civil society, us as industry, we're all still learning as we go, and we are developing our thinking. And so I do want to start really by acknowledging at the outset the challenges that we have here. And I think this has been touched on by both the previous panelists as well. And it's really acknowledging that it's not a small task to craft legislation where the obligations are necessary, they're proportionate, they're calibrated to prevent abuse, and they also still allow for technological innovation, competition, and respect for human rights. And part of that's what's been captured in the title for today's session. This is about privacy, it's about safety, it's about security, and it's about trust. And these are all topics that we take extremely seriously at Microsoft. And we know that regulators, that civil society, and others around the region are working really hard to think through the right balance on these issues. And so in my time today, I wanted to speak to some of the ways in which we at Microsoft are thinking about these issues on a digital safety front. When we are engaging with regulators and others on online harms proposals, we're suggesting a principles-based approach that really acknowledges some of the challenges, but is also intended to provide scope to adapt depending on the particular policy problems and the particular concept. And I'm not going to go through it all, but I'd like to highlight a couple of key principles. And the first point I'd like to highlight really goes to that question of problem definition and the challenge that we're trying to solve. And it's a really simple one in some ways, which is that when we're talking about online harms, when we're talking about digital safety, it is a whole of society problem, and it's one that requires whole of society solutions. And we know that it's not something we as a tech company can solve alone. And I think we've heard a little bit about this in the co-regulatory discussion just previously, but it's also not something that governments can just regulate away either. So regulation absolutely has an important role to play, but there's an ecosystem here. And so we as tech companies, governments, civil society, and users themselves all have roles to play in creating a safer online ecosystem. The second principle that I'd like to highlight is that there's really no one size fits all solution. And we've heard a little bit about some online services already, but what I'd like to highlight is that, you know, there is a really huge variety of online services. The digital economy is the economy. Large technology companies, small technology companies of all sizes are all contributing to the digital economy and to the wider digital landscape. And, you know, we know that at Microsoft because we are a company that offers a very diverse range of tools, from enterprise cloud services to productivity and through to gaming. And that means that we see a need to ensure that obligations for online service providers are really tailored to the nature of the services, and that they take into account a range of factors, including the function of that service, the risk profile, the expectations of its users, the relationship between the service provider and the ultimate end user, and others. And so the measures that might be appropriate to address illegal or harmful content on a general purpose social media platform will look different to those for a search engine or for an email service. And so we really encourage people to think about differentiation between services, both across the top of the tech stack, as you go down the layers of the stack, and between consumer and enterprise services. And we see that taking this kind of differentiated approach can really help produce targeted, effective, and proportionate approaches that ultimately benefit the users of those services. And again, I think, you know, users and choice for users and ensuring users have a good experience has been at the heart of our conversation so far tonight. Thirdly, we see it as important for regulation to really draw bright lines between illegal content and content that's lawful but potentially harmful. And we encourage regulators to provide clarity and transparency for us as a tech company, but also for their citizens by really clearly defining what kind of speech, what kind of content is regulated. We see that regulation dealing with particular types of content should be limited to what's been defined as unlawful And that's where independent courts or other bodies, they can be the decision makers and undertake an appropriate balancing of rights. From our perspective, regulation to address other digital safety risks, so the lawful but awful content, should really focus on systems and processes, including how we comply with our own commitments to users. So we know that it's important we provide clarity and transparency to our users about how we enforce our code of conduct and about the actions that we take to make our services safer. And finally, in the context of a conversation about international approaches, I do want to touch on the importance of maintaining an open internet. So when we're talking about these topics, we really encourage regulators to consider the potential for unintended consequences of any regulatory action. And, you know, with the proliferation of regulation in this space, alongside global trends around digital sovereignty, we are starting to see a risk of fragmentation. And so we encourage regulators to really think about ways to harmonize regulatory measures, to avoid extraterritorial reach, and to try avoid requiring the development of country-specific infrastructure. And there's also a need to avoid creating such a high regulatory burden that none but the largest platforms can compete, or something that really hinders the ability of local services to compete globally. We do want to see a thriving digital space. And I'll finish there because I think that's my time. But I do want to make one final point, which is that, you know, we don't want to shy away from platform responsibility. We know that the harms from online content are real, and we do want to be part of the solutions. And so these conversations are about helping develop solutions that are effective and proportionate and really empower our users and customers.
Thanks, Liz. Some very interesting points there about the principles that that might underpin our approaches to regulation. And I'm sure we'll come back to particularly that point about differentiated approaches. We're going to move on, though, so that we hear from our other two speakers, and then we'll come back and have some questions for Liz and both of them. So, Jean-Pierre, could I ask you to take the floor now, please?
Hello, good morning. Well, good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're at. So thank you for the invite. I'd like to make one point before I jump into the commentary, and that is what I'll be saying today are my own personal views and might not necessarily reflect the views of the TRA. So first off, the question that always comes to mind is why? Why would we seek to regulate online content, especially in a world where we're so reliant on the internet? Pre-pandemic, but even now post-pandemic, perhaps increasingly so. And I'd like to point to a research a bit of work which Ofcom carried out in February last year, and they carried out some sort of research which I thought was really fascinating, and this was part of Ofcom's kind of research into the regulation of online content, and which led to then the online safety bill. And in the UK, at least, and the research showed that at least a third of people feel that the risks of being online far outweigh the benefits, and that 4 in 5 internet users are concerned about going online, and they would welcome tighter rules. Unsurprisingly, the highest level of concern seems to be about children and their exposure to bullying and sexual abuse. And that even more surprisingly, I mean, thank God, has never happened to me or my kids, but 62% of adult users have experienced at least one harmful online experience in the past 12 months, or rather in the 12 months preceding the survey. They also seem to believe that social media sites remain the most commonly cited source of harm. And the following statistic just blew me away. Just in 2019, 69 million images and videos related to child sexual exploitation and abuse were referred by US technology companies to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And that was an increase of 50% on 2018. So the numbers are staggering. In the UK, I know I'm meant to be talking about the GCC, but I need to give some context. So in the UK, and perhaps even in the EU at least, online content regulation is not about censoring. Whereas in this region, in the region of the GCC, broadly speaking, it is. So in the UK, it's more about freedom of expression, and I think one of the previous speakers spoke about the need for some sort of balance between freedom of expression and the need to ensure user safety, and that is exactly what the UK are trying to do. Ofcom aren't being tasked with regulating every single or moderating every single piece of online content, but it's up to the online platforms to adopt appropriate systems and processes to protect those users. What are the GCC countries doing? First of all, it's a bit of a fragmented approach. There's no universal set of rules a la European Union, where there's the European Commission setting out some sort of regulation or decision or whatever it is, and each member state has to transpose that bit of legislation. But therefore every country in the GCC has its own set of rules. They do seem to have a common set of parameters and thresholds, in the sense that they all seem to rely on law, which is perhaps more earmarked, or was initially earmarked for publications and the media. And they've broadened that scope to extend it to the online world. There are a few notable exceptions in the sense of sector-specific legislation, whether bylaws or regulations. For example, us in Bahrain, we have the so-called Internet Safety Regulation. And that requires ISP to comply with takedown notices or blocking requests within 24 hours of receipt of such a request. The parameters which seem to unite the various GCC countries as to what constitutes harmful content are broadly four, if I were to kind of classify them. One is, of course, disrespect of religion, and doesn't necessarily need to be Islam. It could be any religion, morality, public order, and anything which is of seditious content. So, like I said, while the approach seems to be fragmented, at least the purpose and application is broadly similar. Typically, every country would appoint an authority or perhaps a ministry that would be responsible for drawing up a list of prohibited websites. That list would be uploaded into some sort of central management system, which would in turn ensure that those sites get blocked. It goes without saying that list gets updated regularly. However, it's not the first time that one or two sites manage to escape the net. And this is where then the people like us as regulators get involved. I mean, we get requests from the ministry or whoever is the responsible entity to ask ISPs, or rather request order ISPs to block access to that particular website, and this without the need for any court order. Differences between the models adopted in the western part of the world, the EU and the UK, and the GCC. So of course, if you had to look at the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Service Act, the emphasis is more on platforms and the users of those platforms, whereas in the GCC, it's predominantly about websites and ISPs. So yes, there is common ground with regards to the types of harm that would fall foul of the respective laws, so terrorism, sexual exploitation, abuse, etc., etc. But I think the similarities stop abruptly there. So of course, as you probably well know, social media platforms, search engines, video content sharing sites, instant messaging, these all fall within the scope of the Online Safety Act and the Digital Service Act, but they do not in the GCC. There's no similar requirement, and that perhaps is due to the issue of extraterritorial application. Bahrain is a small country. I happen to hail from a much smaller country, which is the smallest country, the smallest member state of the European Union, that is Malta. And in my experience, it is very difficult for small countries to seek to apply the law beyond the shores. If you had to look at the UK online safety bill, for example, there is a section which deals specifically with extraterritorial application. And it's made very clear then that once the bill becomes law, it will apply to providers of regulated services, even those that are based outside of the UK, because they consider, and arguably rightly so, that extraterritorial application is necessary in order to fulfill the bill's aim of protecting UK users online. So the approach within the GCC is fragmented, albeit they cover the same aspect. I do feel that the focus is more about censorship rather than take down notices, and perhaps the focus is more on websites rather than platforms and users of those platforms. So until perhaps the GCC somehow the countries bang their heads together and agree on a unified approach, I suppose countries in this region have to rely on self-regulation, which was just mentioned a few minutes ago, and in any case, if self-regulation, and why do we have self-regulation? If self-regulation is deemed sufficient to not require the intervention of legislators, then I suppose we're all in a happy place. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jean-Pierre. Hopefully we'll come back to that last point, but certainly interesting to hear about the contrast among the GCC nations, and also the point about the challenges for small nations. Before we come back to any of that, though, Kathy, could you round off the panel for us, please, and give us your perspectives from Australian regulation?
Good evening, everyone. The danger in going last on a panel like this is that that I'm covering a bit of ground that has already been covered, but I'll try and move through reasonably quickly. Like the other panelists, I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak about some of the online content issues we're facing here in Australia. In these opening comments, I'm going to focus on two areas. So I'll pick up the theme other panelists have done on our work on disinformation and misinformation on digital platforms. But just as I guess, a new dimension, I just wanted to mention a bit our work on regulating content around television or broadcasting services, including the availability of an expenditure on Australian content here. I will note that the broad topic we're here talking about tonight also crosses over to work that happens in my division around illegal online gambling services and our work around online scams. But I'm not going to touch on those in this comment, but I'm more than happy to pick that up in Q&A if there's any interest. So of course, here at the ACMA, we have a significant role that continues around broadcasting and telecommunication regulation. But that traditional remit is significantly evolving as we respond, like everywhere else, to the very dynamic communication and media environment. Our key reform work in this area is being driven by the government's response to what we call the Digital Platforms Inquiry. So that was an inquiry done by our competition regulator in 2019, which looked at the impact platforms are having in the media and advertising services market. It was quite broad ranging, and a few key actions, there are a range of key actions that the government committed to in its response, a couple related to what I'll talk about tonight. So one of which was the development of a voluntary code on disinformation by digital platforms. There was a commitment to do a staged process around media regulatory reform. And I'm not going to touch on it, but there was also a recommendation to develop a code to address bargaining imbalance between digital platforms such as Facebook and Google and news publishers here in Australia. I'm going to start by talking about the Australian content environment. So in Australia, like other countries, we're seeing some really fundamental changes around content delivery and consumption. In the last 12 months, our research indicates there's been a significant growth in streaming content online, which is set to soon overtake traditional broadcast television in terms of viewing hours. The first stage of the government's reform agenda was announced in September of 2020, which focused on a package of measures to support Australian content, both in terms of the ongoing sustainability of the Australian production sector, but also importantly, to provide for continued access for audiences to what we call local Australian content. So that content, which really resonates with Australians through its themes and language and social values, is considered really critical to supporting our cultural identity and social cohesion. And that, of course, has never been more true than today, given the content landscape is dominated now by large volumes of easily accessible content that comes from elsewhere in the world. Under that package announced in September 2020, we streamlined the program standards for Australian and children's content. That was intended to provide commercial television broadcasting entities with some additional flexibility, really, to be able to meet some obligations, but through a more flexible mix of programming so that they could align with their individual business strategies and their audience appeal. At that time, we also requested information from the 4 largest streaming services operating in Australia about their expenditure on Australian content and the availability of this content on services both here and around the world. So we've now got 2 years of financial data available on our website, which has informed the development of some new regulatory proposals which were announced earlier this week by government in a new media policy statement. So in that statement, the government's announced a proposal for what it's calling a reporting and investment scheme for large streaming services. That scheme would set expectations about investment in new Australian content and require reporting on that investment and efforts to make Australian content discoverable to Australian audiences. That would, the proposal is that would come with some regulation sort of at the back end if the expectations around investment were not met. At the same time, government's asking our national broadcasters, who are called ABC and SBS, to provide information on their contribution to the availability of Australian content. And there's a further component recalibrating the investment requirements for subscription broadcasters around Australian drama content. I think those proposals overall are looking at recalibrating how regulations driving investment into the Australian content market and allowing us to collect and publicly report on that content investment and availability across all of the major services now operating in the Australian market, including, importantly, those large streaming services, providing a more holistic picture to both the sector and government to inform future policy development. I'll just move on to misinformation and disinformation, picking up a theme from other panellists this evening. So, as I mentioned out of that inquiry, the government asked digital platforms to develop a voluntary code of practice on disinformation. So we're talking the self-regulation sphere here. But government did ask ACMA, so the entity I work for, to oversight that process and provide a report to government on our views on the code and our views on the state of disinformation in Australia. We worked really closely with Digi, which is the platform's representative body here in Australia, to develop the code. And as part of that, we released a position paper in June 2020, which is still available on our website. Our intent there was to share our thinking about the types of things a code might like to cover. We also, as part of that work, commissioned some user research into the experience of and attitudes about misinformation and disinformation. And we did a small case study on the financial cost of misinformation to the telco industry here, really looking at the impact of 5G related misinformation and how that translated into financial costs or losses for the telco industry. Now, Digi released its code in February last year, so it's about a year old. Picking up, I think, some of what Liz was saying, importantly, it's an outcomes-based code, so it's not prescriptive as such. It sets out a number of outcomes and objectives, of which 2 are mandatory, so any signatories that sign on have to take action on those 2, and then there are a range of other outcomes which signatories can opt into. I think that approach, like Liz was saying, is really relevant here given the great diversity of business models of digital platforms and what that means for the opportunities for availability of and dissemination or amplification of mis and disinformation online. Now, today we've got 8 platforms signed up to the code, including Google, TikTok and Facebook, now known as Meta. And I would also like to acknowledge that Microsoft has signed up and opted into all commitments under the code. Following the release of the report, each of the signatories published their first annual reports under the code, and they're publicly available. And in August last year, Digi announced arrangements for complaints handling and governance under the code. A review's planned in coming months, and ACMA will continue to work with Digi and the platforms to understand how that code is working and continue our discussions on ways to prevent and combat the scourge of mis and disinformation online, which has a particular focus now in the lead up to our next federal election, which will happen in coming months. Of course, we also hope that the government will soon release the report we provided to it last year, which we think will be an important contribution as we take these conversations and develop initiatives going forward. Just finally, I wanted to touch on a few challenges we experience from a regulator's perspective. So I guess traditionally we've regulated what I'll call traditional telecommunications and broadcasting services. And over a long period of time, we've developed really deep expertise and built very strong relationships with what are largely Australian-based providers in the sector. Here, we're working in relatively new territory when it comes to online content services and digital platforms. And we've worked really hard and will continue to do so to establish and build our relationships with the platforms and their representatives so that we can work effectively in this area. We are, of course, as I mentioned, dealing with many more, I guess, diverse services. So diverse business models, different types of services, different risk and threat profiles. And the scope of the content, of course, is huge and constantly changing. That has been a particular and will be an ongoing challenge for us as a regulator, and particularly when we're looking at an outcomes-based approach to regulation, whether that's self-regulation or other types, given the flexibility that allows the affected entities to build into their responses to the harms or the risks of harms that are evolving in these environments. Of course, the other thing that we do and benefit from really significantly is our relationships with international regulators, and working with them to understand what they're seeing and thinking and talk about what initiatives are being pursued elsewhere and their potential application here. Now, of course, as we increase that collaboration, there's a really strong interest in developing, I guess, a broadly consistent approach to any regulatory action, noting that that can be helpful for both regulators, but of course, and I think Liz at least alluded to this, helpful to platforms who, most of whom are operating across many jurisdictions and are potentially then subject to multiple sets of arrangements for similar activities across the countries within which they operate. I might stop there. I suspect I'm out of time, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Certainly interesting to hear that the other aspect of, I suppose, regulation that is encouraging, in a sense, a positive contribution, obligations in order to contribute something rather than to necessarily prevent some kind of content or conduct. But I might take up that last point that you made about about working across different jurisdictions and the need for collaboration, different regulators to work together, because it's something that I think has come out of a number of the comments that we've heard in this session, and it's something that maybe I'll start with Liz and ask you particularly about that, because you mentioned, well, we know that you're responsible for violent material, for example, so I'm interested in this concept about how, whether you're a regulator or whether you're an industry participant, how you work within that environment where laws and regulations are developed at a national level. You're a service provider, if you like, that as Kathy noted, has to function across a number of different territories. And there's a challenge in doing that. There's a challenge for regulators, but there's also a challenge, obviously, for industry. So perhaps to take that as an example within the area in which you work, when something like that in Australia, there was a scheme dealing with abhorrent violent material that developed in response to the Christchurch mosque killings, and I wonder how you, when something like that develops, how you place that and have to respond to that, how you have to place it within this larger framework of international obligations, how you deal with those specific national responses.
Thanks, Derek. And I think it's a great segue from the conversation and some of the issues that Kathy just raised. And I think, you know, the short answer is it's challenging, but I'll expand on that with a couple of other points. But I'd also just like to start by, you know, really acknowledging the impact of the Christchurch attacks that prompted that particular piece of legislation. As a New Zealander and someone who's working in this area, it is one of those moments. I think our president, Brad Smith, described it as sort of as an inflection point for industry. And I think it's one of those moments where the real impact of real world events and the way those harms can manifest online came into very, very sharp relief. And so I think it's one, you know, where it does really highlight, I think, how this landscape has changed and become more complex as people think in different ways about how the internet can be used to perpetrate harm and expand on real world harms. But actually, to start with that point, really about maintaining the space for voluntary or co-regulatory initiatives. And I think what happened with AVM and the Christchurch attacks is also really illustrated by the role of the Christchurch call to action led by New Zealand and France and others in the wake of that attack, which was really an opportunity to highlight the space that commitments that companies can make alongside governments and civil society in this space to address issues and to really step up and acknowledge the challenge that we face, but also the role of multi-stakeholder approaches in addressing that, but also in voluntary measures. And so alongside, you know, various regulatory measures, including the abhorrent violent materials legislation, that self-regulatory space on this has been really important. You know, the Christchurch call has created a multi-stakeholder community with opportunities for really fruitful conversations on this particular challenge around terrorist and violent extremist content online, but also some of the regulatory self-regulatory measures and cooperation that we as industry are doing through the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. So one of the things that we can do is there are particular challenges in different jurisdictions, particular challenges from different threat actors. But one of the ways that we can, as industry, can grapple with that, and particularly on these really challenging harm types, is through that cross-industry collaboration where we can share knowledge, take on multi-stakeholder approaches, and find ways to deal with that together. But I think the second point that is, it does highlight some of the challenges of patchwork of legislation where sort of single harms might be the focus of a legislative measure, not only actually in sort of a single jurisdiction, but sort of on a global basis where you've got different countries focused on different harms that are then defined in different ways depending on the different aspects, but even within a single jurisdiction. So one of the things I think industry has been highlighting recently in the Australian context is that actually there's been an enormous amount of action on online harms in the space, and Kathy's flagged some of that in the misinformation and disinformation spaces as well. But actually there is a real risk of a landscape which is so busy that it's really hard to know exactly what the most sort of exactly where a company is aiming its efforts and prioritizing what's required to keep up with all the legislative measures, even within a single market. And that becomes even more challenging, actually, even for smaller providers who are looking to grow their business in a single market and be part of that economy. I think that the final point that I'd make is, as we're kind of grappling with a really complicated landscape within markets, but also sort of cross-jurisdictionally, it's really important to us to have that clarity around what our obligations are, both for us as companies to know what we're complying with in a particular jurisdiction, but also actually for users as well. And I think one of the things the AVM law is an example of too, and it comes back to some of the conversation at the start of this panel, is it's really important for users to kind of understand the landscape they're operating in as well, especially when we're talking about content laws and what they're able to share as well. And obviously abhorrent violent material is at the very far end of the spectrum. None of us want that content on our platforms, none of us want to see that disseminated, but that clarity and obligations and the way those are defined, ideally there's some synchronicity across jurisdictions on those, but at the very least having that real clarity so that we know in a particular jurisdiction what's required of us, but users can also know what's required of them as well.
Thanks very much, Liz. Jean-Pierre, if I could come to you, you mentioned that there are some points of commonality in the approaches within GCC countries, and also that the approach essentially is to is regulating at the ISP level rather than digital platforms. I was interested in whether maybe there are some there's an example from an industry other than the communications or TMT sector that shows GCC countries working together. But I also wonder, on the basis of what Liz and Kathy have just been speaking about, whether misinformation and disinformation, given those four topics that you outlined before, or those four broad areas, whether misinformation and disinformation is something that the GCC, in relation to platforms in particular, is likely to see as an area of activity, and or whether it is on an individual country level, and maybe that approach that Kathy's describing, which is actually self-regulation, industry-based, but is at a national level, is something that that might be adopted rather than more formal regulation.
Okay, thanks for the questions, Derek. So first of all, starting off with your first question with regards to whether we can draw from other examples across the region and not necessarily in the TMT space. I'm not sure about non-TMT space, but there is another example within the telco world, and that probably is in relation to lawful access. So as you know, communications do get intercepted, and obviously for security reasons, and particularly in this region, and that is something which is very sensitive. And there was a point in time where I don't need to mention which application that was, but security organs could not access communication or messages that were exchanged over a particular platform. And I think what happened was that they did collaborate, they did put their combined weight together, and I do believe that access to that platform was finally voluntarily given. So there wasn't even a law that required that. It was just a negotiation. which happened with the platform itself, and that information was shared. With regards to whether there should be whether misinformation and disinformation is on the radar, I can speak about Bahrain and specifically about what we do. We are very much, I'd like to think, consumer focused. So if we feel, and we do feel, that there is a potential harm or concern for the consumer, then we'd seek to address it. Like I said, the challenge that we have is the jurisdiction jurisdictional limitations. So again, I suppose I am repeating a bit myself, but I don't. At least at this moment in time, I don't see how we could possibly seek to apply our regulation and enforce that regulation on global platforms, in the sense that probably for the larger ones, because Bahrain or Malta, whatever it is so small, that probably the cost of compliance would outweigh the benefits of them seeking to provide services in their jurisdiction. I happened to read, whether earlier this morning or yesterday, there was a news article, if I'm not mistaken, where was it Facebook? And then one of these mega platforms was threatening that pull out of Europe because of the cost of regulation. So if they're willing or threatening to do so for Europe, what would they do for a country which has 1.5 million in terms of population? Self-regulation, like I said, I think for the time being at least, we have to live with that, and hopefully we have to rely on hopefully the EU and our bigger brothers like the UK get it right, because I'm sure that what would happen is that for the mega platforms of this world, once they have a compliance cost or regulatory cost and to comply with the requirements of other jurisdictions, the bigger jurisdictions, they probably wouldn't change their own rules to adopt something different for this part of the world. So I think it's one of the ways. Either the GCC states would somehow meet up and agree on a common set or common set of approach, or else they could perhaps have more of a close collaboration with the EU counterparts and try and influence what is going on there, so that what the EU kind of comes up with, that would be perhaps also applicable and relevant for this part of the world.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Is there actually a formal forum where GCC and EU people exchange views?
I have seen treaties that cater for this, but the treaties that I've seen are between the EU and specific GCC countries rather than GCC as a whole. I tend to be corrected. It's just what I've seen, so that could very well be something else.
Okay. Thanks very much. On those themes, I would like to come back to Kathy, if we have time, and ask about a different aspect of online regulation that presents difficulties with offshore participants, which relates to online gambling. But just before we do that, I'll go back to Torsha and Chen Ling and just ask you if there's anything that's come out of the discussion that's involved Liz and Jean-Pierre and Kathy that you'd like to respond to about the approaches taken by industry or by regulators. Chen-Ling, I know you've been a regulator, and Torsha, I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to comment on in the light of what you've heard.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it super brief. I know we are we have very limited time right now. So I think this sense that I've got from this discussion, and generally also, there are a lot of incredible people that are working in this space and with great ideas. But at least from where I have seen, there is a lot of talking at each other without really there being enough collaboration. So perhaps dialogues like these and more spaces, perhaps there should be more spaces where people can actually come together to think of advocacy agendas and think of reforms in whatever way that looks like. So that's the first thing that I wanted to just flag. And the second thing is with self-regulatory mechanisms, I know the GIFCity was being mentioned and the Christchurch call has also been mulled over in the past. I think, I mean, these are absolutely necessary steps that we do need to take to ensure that these incidents, the incidents that preceded them, do not repeat themselves. I think the flip side of this is that for these to be sort of contemporary to the human rights need at any point, there should be periodic assessment and periodic auditing of the processes involved to see that they are still online for what the things that they say they're going to be for. So I think the GIFCity underwent a human rights process last year, and other, I'm not sure about the Christchurch call, but like similar processes should be there for the Facebook Oversight Board and whatever self-regulatory bodies that come up. So as a principle, I think having periodic sunset reviews is something that these bodies can think about adopting. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chen-Ling, is there anything that you'd like to add on the basis of what we've heard from the other speakers?
Okay, thank you. I think from the traditional definition, people think that when the government intervene into regulating speech, it's kind of, you know, the invasion of freedom of speech. But according to the Universal Human Rights Declaration, there are two meanings of freedom of speech. One is, of course, you have to protect every individual's human right to speak. But on the other side, the government has the responsibility to maintain quality speech and content for the whole society. So from these two, I think from these two sides of definition of freedom of speech, there are rooms for the government to intervene into, especially in the digital age. When we talk about the balance of power, you know, by the definition of democracy, currently the international digital corporations, many of them have the power more than the small countries, such as Taiwan or maybe Bahrain or, you know, other small countries. So they are the, you know, yeah, they are the great power in the global societies. So they need, you know, the government to maybe, I would like to say, to negotiate with the international corporations, with the local, you know, civil societies. Of course, it's not easy to get the universal answer for, you know, regulating or, you know, maintain the content quality, because every society has its specific situation. For example, in Taiwan, we have the problem with mainland China, which cause, you know, some kind of situation, maybe some similar to the situation in Australia in recent years, this kind of thing. So I still believe that to, you know, keep a negotiation on and a conversation on is, you know, it's necessary for our society, and I think for the other societies. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Kathy, we've got a few minutes to come back to you, and I noticed actually, I think Jean-Pierre referred to that dilemma where you're faced maybe with the prospect of a big platform leaving the market, and that was something that you mentioned briefly in passing before, the news media remuneration scheme that was developed by a competition regulator, and it was a moment that Australia experienced for a moment, and the government stood its ground, and that worked. But I wonder, gambling, is there anything that you'd like to comment on in relation to that issue, or actually this other issue about gambling, which presents its own particular difficulties in imposing, I suppose, local national expectations on participants that are, you know, that might be located offshore?
Yeah, sure. Gambling, the joy of my life. So I think, and it probably goes back to what Jean-Pierre said in some of his opening statements there, when we think about, from a regulator's perspective, applying laws which have extraterritorial application. So our gambling laws in Australia prohibit certain types of online gambling, so casinos and slot games, being provided or targeted to Australians here. And now most of the services that are available here, and there are lots of them, the illegal ones that is, originate offshore for us. They are, and in that respect, they're unlike the other entities we regulate. So if I think about the broadcasting sector, they are entities which largely we license. We know who they are, we know who the contacts are, we can work with them regularly. Here we're often dealing with very complex corporate structures where the people who operate them are hidden behind these structures, and often very difficult to identify. Where we can work out which jurisdiction they're in, they are often unregulated jurisdictions. So, so the ability to deal with the foreign regulator is often not available to us. And of course, they have no incentive whatsoever to deal with us, because they're making money off their services being provided in Australia. In that environment, of course, the usual types of enforcement action we would take, particularly when we're dealing with our domestic industries, are largely ineffective. If we can't find the people who are running it, then a lot of enforcement options just become unavailable to us. And in that respect, we've sort of, you know, I guess we've had to get pretty creative in there. And so some of the things we found really successful in this space are, we do have some powers under the Australian law to block websites. Now, that's not something that we do easily here. We value freedom of expression. And so it is a big deal for us to ask an internet service provider to block websites, but we have powers once we've found a service to be illegal. And since we started doing that in 2019, we've blocked almost 300 websites, and as a result, we've seen much reduced, well, I should say, often when we block websites, the providers then phoenix them up again. They come up time and time again under other names, but when we track through traffic to those websites, we see much reduced traffic, which is an indicator we're disrupting those services, and that those consumers are, I guess, exposed to less harm as a result. The other thing, there are two other things I'll just quickly mention there, is we look at intermediaries. So we've had quite some success where we can't find the service providers, working with things like software providers for the services or payment system providers, who often, once they become aware that their services are being used in the provision of gambling services which are illegal here, will take their own action, which also disrupts the services. And the final thing, picking up, I think what I mentioned earlier and has come up as a theme a bit in today's discussion, is working with foreign regulators as well. So to the extent our law allows, and there are some limitations around that, actually working with regulators in some of the other key jurisdictions to exchange information about what we're seeing. And that has often proved fruitful in discovering additional information, which helps us to work out what strategies might be best to explore in terms of particular services. So, I mean, that's it. I guess just different perspective on some of the difficulties in operating with extraterritorial laws, and like the rest of the content sector, that is a rapidly evolving environment. I think most recently we're finding increased use of cryptocurrency an additional challenge in that environment, but it's certainly a very interesting part of our work around combating online harms.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kathy. And I guess that last example you're giving is a good contrast to some of the other areas we've been discussing, in which I think Liz made the point of the importance of this kind of multi-stakeholder environment and seeking regulatory solutions via that kind of collaborative involvement that Chen Ling described earlier as well, where it's possible. But you make the good point that it's not always possible. So good to end on that. So we're out of time now. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, Torsha, Chen Ling, Liz, Jean-Pierre and Kathy, for your really interesting contributions to a quite complex topic, but nevertheless showing some of the importance of approaching some of these issues in a cross-border sense, having an awareness of regulation in different jurisdictions. So thanks very much to all of you for your time.